Welcome to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. I'm your host, Molly Watts. If you want to change your drinking habits and create a peaceful relationship with alcohol, you're in the right place. This podcast explores the strategies I use to overcome a lifetime of family alcohol abuse, more than 30 years of anxiety and worry about my own drinking, and what felt like an unbreakable daily drinking habit. Becoming an alcohol minimalist means removing excess alcohol from your life so it doesn't remove you from life. It means being able to take alcohol or leave it without feeling deprived. It means to live peacefully, being able to enjoy a glass of wine without feeling guilty and without needing to finish the bottle. With science on our side, we'll shatter your past patterns and eliminate your excuses. Changing your relationship with alcohol is possible. I'm here to help you do it. Let's start now. Well, hello and welcome or welcome back to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast with me, your host, Molly Watts, coming to you from, it's a sodden, Oregon right now. I couldn't decide whether I was going to use sodden or saturated, but you get the general gist, I think. It's very, very wet here in Oregon right now. Blustery, rainy, cold, and just one of those kind of time to cozy up with a sweatshirt and sweater and some mug of something warm weather for sure. Hey, welcome to the podcast. This week on the show, I am sharing an episode that I did over on the Change Academy podcast recently, and I wanted to share it here. Monica said I could, and I think you guys are going to get a lot out of this conversation that we had. The conversation is all about sticking to a routine, or this idea that going off of a routine is somehow kind of enjoyable, or like a vacation or a holiday, or even maybe a celebration. Many of you know I just celebrated my birthday. And there have been a lot of occasions around that and kind of things that are taking me maybe in a direction that might be quote unquote off plan or out of routine. And I'm looking ahead. We've got lots of, the holidays coming. And even during the course of the holidays, I'm going on a little vacation. And all of those things can really add up to getting out of a routine. And what I've found is that it's within a routine that is where my peace actually lives, even though sometimes it feels like I think I want to take a break from my routine and that will be freeing. But that's the conversation that Monica and I really shared here on this episode of Change Academy, and one that I thought you would all enjoy as well. I will be back next week, and until then, I'm actually doing an episode next week, one that I've been, not reluctant to do, but it's definitely taken me a while to get prepared for it. I'm going to be talking about grief, so just a spoiler alert and a heads up for those of you that might be navigating grief right now. And I thought it was an appropriate conversation to have next week, as it's going into the week of Thanksgiving. And for those of you that have been around for a while, you know that Thanksgiving is a particularly poignant time for me, as my father passed away on Thanksgiving night 2 years ago now. And so I'm going to talk about grief next week. And it's an episode that, like I said, it's taken me a while to get ready and to be able to know exactly what I want to say, especially around the conversation around alcohol and grief. That's next week, though. This week, I'm sharing this episode with Monica. If you haven't checked out the Change Academy podcast, you really ought to, or her long-standing podcast, Nutrition Diva. And here is my conversation with my friend and phenomenal coach, by the way, as somebody who coaches me still, both in business and in other life coach areas, Monica Reinagel. Here is our conversation from the Change Academy podcast. Have a great week, everyone. I'll see you next week.
Today, we're exploring this really interesting paradox of how structure and routine can actually lead to a feeling of greater freedom and well-being in our lives. And I'm delighted to welcome back a familiar voice for Change Academy listeners, my dear friend and my colleague, Molly Watts. Many of you know Molly as the host of the Alcohol Minimalist podcast and the author of Breaking the Bottle Legacy. Molly's work, including her coaching programs, focuses on helping people create a more peaceful relationship with alcohol. And she's been a guest on this show many times, sharing her insights on behavior change and mindset shifts. Well, a couple of weeks ago, Molly and I were just catching up on each other's lives. And as we were talking, she shared a story that launched us into a fascinating conversation about how routines and structure actually lead to more freedom, not less. And as you'll hear, this is something that we have not only experienced in our personal lives, but it is a theme that comes up over and over again in our work with clients. And we also quickly realized that this was a conversation that we wanted to have with you, our listeners. So today, Molly and I are going to explore why breaking routines often leaves us feeling worse, not better. And while we touch on how this applies to alcohol consumption and weight management, this principle extends to many, if not every area of our life. So here's our conversation, and I'll be back on the other side with some practical takeaways for you. Welcome back to the Change Academy, Molly. It has been too long.
It has been too long.
And as often happens, this episode today grew out of a conversation that you and I were having behind the scenes. And so maybe just to bring everybody into the conversation, would you be willing to share some of what you related to me in that conversation about your experience when you took a couple of days off from work recently and had a long weekend to enjoy?
Yeah. So I was really looking forward to the weekend was supposed to be a weekend away from home, away from work, like a little mini vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And plans changed. And so I decided to just still take the days off work and make a staycation. And which is great, right? And then as I was approaching the first day off, which was a Friday morning, I kind of had that little voice in my head that was like, oh, you don't usually get to sleep past this hour. I was in a very strong routine of waking up every morning, doing my workout like first thing. And I talked myself out of getting up and decided, I've got all day, I'll work out later. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Then I've also been trying to instill a long-term habit pattern of paying attention to the food that I'm eating. And of course, I had a conversation with myself that morning about allowing myself to have something that I wouldn't normally have for breakfast because I was home and I could make it. And it wasn't, I had this whole,
You're on vacation.
I'm on vacation. So I did that. The day went along, and then I decided to not work out later. I don't even remember the reason or rationale that I had for it. But of course, there was some sort of rationale, and I didn't. And I had alcohol that night, which was a planned drinking night for me. So for those of you that know me, you know that I do plan like the nights that I'm going to include alcohol in my life. And that wasn't problematic. It wasn't, and I didn't go overboard, and I stuck to my planned drinks. But what then transpired was the same exact pattern on Friday. I kind of repeated on Saturday, repeated on Sunday, and then repeated again by Monday. So instead of doing my normal thing, getting up, working out, paying attention to food I was eating or not eating, and having like alcohol-free days built in after planned alcohol days, I didn't. And by the time I got down to the beginning of Tuesday, I was just in this energy funk, I will call it, for lack of a better way to describe it. And I just want to be clear, like nothing I did was like, I certainly wasn't over drinking by anyone's standards. I certainly wasn't like overeating a bunch of indulgent food. I wasn't not moving at all. I didn't do my workouts. But by Tuesday, I felt almost depressed. And I immediately wanted to attribute it to being gone on vacation and having to go back into the work process, right? Like, oh, well, here I am, have to go back to work, right? But Tuesday morning, I got up, did my workout routine, kind of went back to my normal rhythm. And then by like Wednesday, I was like, oh, I like feel better. Like I kind of thought that being out of routine was this freedom and was going to be a relaxing thing.
And what I found is that it actually didn't relax me. It actually made me feel kind of stressed out and a little bit depressed and not energetic at all. So, yeah, so that had us getting into that conversation because so often both of us hear from people that they want to not have to be so rigid about
Yes.
things. They don't want to have to plan ahead. They don't want to have to schedule themselves, and they want to just be more free, right?
Yes.
And I think that there's maybe something wrong with our thinking regarding that, because I'm not sure that not having a routine and being unstructured and kind of going laissez-faire like actually equates to freedom. At least it doesn't for me.
That's right. And as I was listening to you that morning describing this to me, I was also thinking, wow, we may have had this whole idea about post-vacation blues completely wrong, because it tends to
Right.
occur as we are going back to work. And so we misattribute any negative emotions that we may feel, or partially misattribute them to the fact that, oh, now my vacation's over, I'm going back to work. But how much of it is actually just the accumulated impact of having taken time away from routines that we put into place in the first place because they work for us, and they help us feel better, do better. And what we both took away from that initial conversation before we decided, hey, let's stop talking about this until we can record a podcast episode, is this idea that structure and routine is not the opposite of freedom, but actually the scaffolding that makes a feeling of freedom possible.
Right. Which is fascinating to me, because for many years I believed it was exactly the opposite.
Right.
But what I think you and I have learned over the course of figuring these things out for ourselves and for clients is that sustainable change means being consistent over time, and it means doing it over and over and over again.
That's right. And that is where a lot of the benefit of some of those routines that we put into place, whether it is that early morning workout or some meal planning or the way we structure our time, or maybe it's having a daily meditation practice or something else that we do to support our mental well-being. The benefits of those things are not so much in doing them once. There's no one workout that gets us in shape. There's no one meditation that durably increases our feeling of peace or well-being. The benefits of those things are in their consistency. And I think that we underestimate just how much comfort we get and benefit we get from remaining consistent over time. Just what you're describing, I think a lot of people would resonate with, that bristling against the idea that you have to do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time and adhere to a schedule. That does kind of get our back up. And maybe there is a cultural narrative that we should be free to just do what we want to do, or that is a more enjoyable way to live our lives. But as you found, as I have found, as we have both seen in our coaching practices, the reality is that being consistent with those routines that maintain our well-being is actually what unlocks the benefits of them. And I do want to talk a little bit today about how we can balance the benefits of consistency and routine with flexibility, because we don't want to be locked into overly rigid routines, if for no other reason than the fact that sometimes we don't have a choice. So in the example that we started with today, you were on vacation, you chose to relax your routines.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes, though, we don't have a choice. Our routines are disrupted by factors beyond our control. So I think we do have to build in a certain amount of flexibility. But I think the main insight is really in how we think about this. As you said, our thoughts about freedom and flexibility and rigidity, we may be tripping over those more often than we actually need to.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit about how you work with your clients on this, because one of the cornerstones of your approach to creating a more peaceful relationship with alcohol is to create what you referenced before, a plan for when and how much you're going to drink. And I know from conversations that we've had that Clients are often extremely resistant to this idea for a whole variety of reasons. They don't like this idea. What are some of the reasons that you think people find this to be so challenging? Because just to fill people in who may not be familiar, you're not actually dictating what should be on that plan or how much
Right.
should be on that plan, just that there be a plan. So, given that they can make whatever plan they want, why is this so challenging for people?
Right. So there's a couple of reasons. The first thing is that there's obviously a lot of history typically with people regarding alcohol specifically where they've never, I mean, maybe with diets, like people have like tracked food before. Drinking seems to be one of those things that just kind of happens to people, on a Friday night or at a party. They're not really like going into it with a plan. They never have had that experience, and it feels like just by the whole idea of trying to make a plan around alcohol, it's kind of like raising their hand and saying, okay, I have a problem here. And there is quite a lot of black and white thinking that happens around drinking that fuels that kind of resistance from that perspective. The other perspective is that, just like you said, I don't dictate to people what that plan looks like. I, in fact, encourage people to start by meeting themselves where they are. And so often when people come to me, they are drinking more than they want to be, or in their logical minds that they think is a good number, a healthy number, a reasonable number. Use your adjective of choice. And so putting a number down that they have a lot of judgment against, like this is too much, feels very counterintuitive to them. And
I could totally understand why.
Right. Yeah.
Putting it's almost like we're planning to overconsume.
Right. And giving ourselves permission.
Which feels
right.
totally wrong. Right.
Right, completely. But the difference is that before people work with me, they're making the decisions in the moment after they've started drinking. And then they're like, I'll have another, I'll have another. And when we force ourselves to start looking ahead, making a plan with our logical prefrontal cortex, we are deciding ahead of time. We are making our brains use that future focused part of the brain, as opposed to that lower in the moment impulsive center of the brain, which is usually where that decision has been coming from. We want to move the decision up to the prefrontal cortex. And what I tell everybody is this is a process. Right. This is a training. This is retraining your brain. We don't make our decisions for alcohol in the moment anymore. Right. And that's why we do it. We're not going to stay at that number, but we have to first at least establish trust with ourselves, right, that we can make a plan and stick to it.
Right. So there's two parts of that. One is starting to set up this expectation of when we make these decisions. We're going to make them ahead of time. And then secondly, what we're practicing initially is sticking to the plan.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I say it's a doable drink plan. I want you to be 80 to 90% sure that you can do it.
So we're not immediately practicing reducing our consumption. Right. We're practicing sticking to the plans that we've made. And I know that doesn't always go perfectly. We are practicing because we are not yet perfect. Right. And so we're practicing a few different things there, and that can then lead to, as you said, a greater feeling of trust, and then maybe some new possibilities become available to us because we are setting up a structure that can ultimately pave the way towards feeling more freedom.
100%. At least that was my own experience, and hopefully what I help other people figure out as well. But it started for me with meeting myself where I was at, and then I talk about continuous improvement and Kaizen and small steps, right? And when we go back to this idea of consistency and doing things over time and sustainable change, we have to be willing to figure out whether it's around alcohol or food or movement or meditation or gratitude. We have to figure out the things that we want to keep doing for the rest of our lives. Right. And that's where the flexibility, I think, comes in, Monica, what you were saying before about we don't want to get too rigid, right? It isn't that there's one perfect diet. There isn't one perfect exercise routine or meditation. It's that we have to figure out what works for us in any given time. And then if it quits working, then we got to figure out something else.
Yes.
Hey there, it's Molly taking a quick break to talk with you about Sunnyside. You all know that Sunnyside is my app of choice and my recommendation for a tool to help you create sustainable change around your drinking. One of the things that I love about Sunnyside is their commitment to improving the user experience, and that has been a constant since I started working with them nearly 3 years ago now. Since June this year, they have added the Android version of their iOS app, so now it's available for Apple users and all Android users. It's the same Sunnyside experience across all of those devices, and it's just another example of their commitment to improving the user experience. Another example would be the fact that now you can set it up for push notifications. So you can take all of the daily texts, the reminders, and put them into a push preference so that you determine how you want to receive the support from Sunnyside. I would love for you to check it out. Go to www.sunnyside.co/Molly to get started with a 15-day free trial today.
As you know, a lot of the coaching that I do with people focuses on sustainable weight management, which turns out to be about all kinds of things besides just what we eat, right? It touches pretty much all aspect of our lives. And the approach that we take is very much what you just described. Like, what can we set into place that feels sustainable for life? How can we stop trying to lose weight, which we do over and over again, and start just living a lifestyle that allows us to weigh less? But at the end of the day, it often involves us being willing to exercise some restraint about what we're going to eat. Because, and this isn't just about food, I mean, most of us cannot just eat or spend or drink or whatever as much as we might want to. We do have to exercise some restraint from time to time. I think of that as just one of the basic, functions of being an adult. And so this is one of the things that we're working on. How can we exercise some restraint? And very frequently, I hear people expressing what feels like a longing to go back to the days, the days when they could just eat as much as they wanted. And I think that this is like a mirage. It isn't what we think it is. We see it out there in the future or in the past, and we idealize it. But when we really examine it more closely, it turns out not to be quite what we think it is. Because, eating or spending or drinking or whatever to the point where we then feel poorly, whether physically or emotionally, like feeling like we've lost control or we've made bad choices, or just that feeling of frustration with ourselves. None of those things feel like freedom to me.
Right.
Anyway.
No, they don't.
And frequently those consequences, those unpleasant feelings are far larger and more long-lasting than any, sense of exhilaration we might have felt when we just let ourselves off the leash. So we do a lot of work around reframing this concept of freedom around food to appreciate how exercising a little bit of restraint can actually enhance our enjoyment of what we decide we do want to include in our lives. When we choose our indulgences ahead of time and consciously, we can anticipate them. We can show up for them more fully than when we are just free to do whatever we want to do at every moment. And so I have found for myself personally and with my clients that when we put some structure or some guardrails into place, this actually feels a lot more relaxing than feeling like we are free to do whatever we want.
Yes, and we have to really pay attention to the way that we talk to ourselves about that. And it's just like you said, reframing is a key all the time, right? Because those sentences in our brains, we're not just reporting, we are literally kind of prescribing how we're going to feel.
Editorializing. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So I do want to pivot our conversation from this more conceptual and abstract level and talk a little bit more practically about what this looks like on the ground, how we do this. We don't have to routinize every single aspect of our existence, but I think
Mhm.
there are a few things that when we are more consistent with them actually do make us healthier mentally, physically, emotionally. One of them, I think, would be a consistent sleep schedule.
Without question.
And the research on sleep really shows that even if you're getting the same number of hours of sleep, it's really beneficial if you're getting them more or less at the same time of day
Right.
or night every day. Healthy eating habits, obviously, sticking to a regular exercise routine. What else would you add here? Mindful alcohol consumption, for sure.
Well, I, of course, would include that because that's kind of what I talk about. And I would include two other things, probably for me, would be a gratitude expression. I think the science proves that when we focus our brain and we are choosing to look for opportunities each day to be grateful for our lives and for the things that we have, it really is a known mental health tool. And relaxation, whether you meditate or listen to music or read or take a
Yes.
bath, but we have to take opportunity to de-stress our
Yes.
lives.
And there are a lot of different stress management techniques, but tending to our mental health in those ways is, for me, very much a part of my routine that I don't want to abandon just because I'm on vacation or something. Even if in the moment I may feel like, it's Saturday, I don't have to get right at it. But I have learned over and over again by trial and error, lots of error, that when I abandon those routines, it is not a net positive for me. And there's actually one more that I would add to our list, and that is social connection and
Yep, I was going to say the
relationship.
same thing. Talk to a friend, like my friend Monica.
Yes, yes, our connections to other humans, which can also look a lot of different ways. Guys, Molly and I live 3,500 miles apart, so this
Yes, we
does not have
do.
to be in real life. But yeah, so those are some of the things I think that belong in our routines. But another practical thing that I would suggest for you is to not be afraid to make this enjoyable. Your daily routines that support your mental and physical and emotional health don't have to be all work and no play. You can make these routines more enjoyable by incorporating the elements that you find pleasurable. So, how you exercise, how
Right.
you practice stress management, how you nurture your social connections, those are all areas where you do have a lot of freedom to choose what is most enjoyable for you. So, I don't want to make this just sound like a big dreary to-do list. I think we should challenge ourselves to find ways to make these routines as enjoyable as possible. That's just going to help us be more consistent and less susceptible to that little voice in our head that says, like, oh, let's take the day off.
Right. And I would just add that when that voice starts telling you, oh, just take the day off, instead, like, we've got 5 minutes. Let's just do 5 minutes.
That's right.
We so often talk ourselves out of something because there's this idea like it's not enough. It's not good enough. If I don't have a half an hour to get my sweat on, I might as well not do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, you don't have to write 2 pages in a gratitude journal. Type out one note on your phone and
Yeah.
that's good enough. Allow things to be good enough so that you have that consistency over time.
And I think that's a perfect illustration of how we can balance flexibility with structure. So we've decided that there are these core routines that we really want to be consistent with, but we can be flexible about how we exercise them. And as my previous co-host and our mutual friend Brock Armstrong used to say, like, what's the minimum effective dose here?
Right.
And sometimes we are going to just go for the minimum effective dose, but that still builds consistency. So again, just kind of finding that balance between a consistent routine and a flexible routine.
Right.
And, I think this is perfect timing for the conversation at this time of year because we're sort of staring down the at the end of the year holidays. And this is a time when our routines are very often disrupted, or we might be lucky enough to be looking forward to having some time off, some time away from our usual routines. So perhaps we can just wrap up our conversation today by talking a little bit about how we might approach time off or holidays or vacations a little bit more intentionally, a little bit more mindfully, so that we don't then have that post-vacation letdown or blues, a good part of which may actually be because we got too far away from our core routines.
Yeah. I have a little trip coming up in the midst of December, in the midst of the holidays, and this idea that I can still enjoy myself and still experience everything that I want to experience in that time away without it doesn't have to be one or the other, right? I can actually have a really enjoyable time without eating everything on the table here at Thanksgiving. And if you stick to the plan, really check in with yourself after the day after and see, how does it feel? Do you feel happy? Do you feel proud? Are you realizing like, oh, hey, I actually can do this and I enjoyed myself and it didn't feel like I wasn't restricted. I felt like I got to, enjoy everything around me, and I'm coming out of it knowing that I had a plan in place and I stuck to it, and that feels really great, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We often forget to do those little postmortems when things go well. We just kind of move on. We never forget to do them when things go poorly, right? We spend a lot of time rehashing and beating ourselves up and feeling like we wished it had gone differently. We often forget to do that same thing for ourselves, to pause and notice how it feels different when we make different choices. So that is great advice. And obviously, if you are on vacation or away from home, you may again want to be flexible, be ready to adapt your routines to your environment. You may find that your daily movement routine happens in a different place or in a different way. So you want to just kind of key into like, what are the core elements here that I'm trying to preserve, and realize that there's going to be some difference. And the last little piece of advice that I have is something that we talk about in the Way Less program a lot, about sticking the landing. And what I mean by that is, let's say we fired you up in this episode and you've got a vacation coming up and you really do some thoughtful preparation for that. And you establish your mindset and you make some commitments to yourself. You're going to try this and see how it goes. And it goes great. Make sure that you have extended your planning and your thinking about this to extend a couple of days back into your transition home, because I've seen this often fall apart. People set themselves this challenge. They do fabulously on their vacation, on their holiday. They really feel great about it, but they get back to work and it kind of all falls apart. And so we try to include the transition back into normal life as part of our mental planning, and even to put some things into place before you go to help make that transition work better. So you might want to just go ahead and schedule those first couple of exercise sessions into your calendar for those days after you return home, or leave a couple of meals in the freezer to get out and have that first day or two before you've gotten fully back into your shopping and cooking routines, so that you can stick the landing.
Right.
And that seems like a good place to pause this conversation. I'll say pause because I trust that you will be back again before too long. But thank you for sharing with our listeners and with me some of your experience and some of your thoughts about how adhering to structure creatively and flexibly and compassionately actually helps us create more freedom in our lives. I think you've given us all a lot to chew on.
Yeah, well, and I hope what they hear from us both, Monica, is that we're still doing the work, right? All the time in our lives. This is not about, oh, I've got this all dialed in, right? I'm a work in progress. And the bottom line is we got to just keep getting right back in and doing the work and being consistent with it. I do feel a sense of freedom that I've never had before around a lot of areas in my life. And it's because I've decided to get consistent with things.
Well, thank you so much, Molly, and come back soon.
Thank you for having me, Monica.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Molly Watts. I want to leave you with a few just sort of concrete takeaways from our discussion today. Number one, we really need to challenge our assumptions about what freedom really means in our lives. True freedom often comes from embracing structure, not abandoning it. Number two, having true consistency is what really leads to improved mental and physical well-being. Number three, it's important to build some awareness of how routine disruptions might affect us so that we can make better choices. And number four, structure and routine are not the opposite of freedom. They are the scaffolding that make freedom possible. And with practice, and that's important, with practice, we can learn to enjoy the freedom that comes from maintaining some structure in our lives. And now I want to encourage you to spend some time reflecting on your own routines and the structures that you have in place. Are there areas where you might benefit from more structure or just more consistency? Or maybe are there places where you need to build in a little bit more flexibility so that your routines can withstand the stuff that comes up? Remember, the goal here is not to impose rigid rules that feel confining to you, but to create a flexible framework that supports your well-being and helps you achieve your goals. Because as you've just heard us talking about today, when we implement thoughtful structure in our lives, we actually do have the capacity to create greater freedom and mental clarity and just overall life satisfaction.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. Take something you learned from this week's episode and put it into action. Changing your drinking habits and creating a peaceful relationship with alcohol is 100% possible. You can stop worrying, stop feeling guilty about overdrinking, and become someone who desires alcohol less. I work with people in 3 ways. You can learn about them over at www.mollywatts.com/workwithme. Or better yet, reach out to me directly. It's molly@mollywatts.com. We'll jump on a call and discuss what's best for you. This podcast is really just the beginning of our conversation. Let's keep it going.